to verify the residence of the registrant. Postal verification cards cannot be forwarded by the Postal Service, and so their return indicates that there's a question about the name and address on the card. It does not necessarily mean a person is ineligible to vote, but there was a problem with delivery of that card. If that card comes back and election officials are not able to resolve the reason it came back, the record, again, will be challenged in the statewide voter registration system. Then over time, county election officials update voter records based on information that is shared with the statewide voter registration system. And if I can refer you to page 25 in our evaluation, we have a table that lists all the different sources of information that are shared with the statewide voter registration system. So for example, that information might indicate that the voter has died or has moved or has been convicted of a felony or discharged from a felony sentence. If the data indicate that a voter's eligibility to vote is in question, again, county election officials will challenge them in the statewide voter registration system. Now, if information is accurate and up to date and there are no challenges next to a voter's name, then on election day, that person will be able to enter the polling place, sign their roster, which includes an oath attesting to their eligibility, and they will be permitted to vote. Now, the steps to registration differ for someone who registers on election day. For someone who registers on election day, they complete the same voter registration application, which includes the 8-part statement certifying their eligibility to vote. Then they provide proof of residence to an election judge at the polling place. And if I can refer you to page 10 of our report, we list the different proofs of residence that voters may use when they register on election day. After a person has completed their application and an election judge has accepted their proof of residence, they can sign a roster, which again includes an oath certifying or attesting to their eligibility, and they will be permitted to vote. But the verification I described earlier against driver and vehicle services records and updates from other sources of information will occur after the person has voted. So all of this information in the statewide voter registration system will affect what's printed on the roster on election day. And what's printed on the roster on election day is going to determine how a person is able to vote. So if the voter information on the roster is incorrect, or if the person is not listed on the voter roster, they will have to register on election day. If they are listed on the voter roster, but there is a challenge notation next to their name, for most challenges, they will have to complete a process which we called the Oath for Challenged Voters. And I'll talk a little bit about how much each of these processes were used. So in the 2016 general election, about 12% of the 2.96 million people who voted registered on election day. And as this slide shows, most of those people were updating their registration information. So for example, they had moved or they had had a name change and they had to change that before they could vote. The next largest group are people who registered for the first time, and then finally, people who had to reactivate their registration. So a registration record might be inactivated if a person moved out of state. County election staff will inactivate their record. Or annually, the Secretary of State's office does a process called annual list maintenance, where they inactivate the records of voters who have had no voter-initiated activity for 4 years. So they haven't voted, they haven't submitted an address update or something like that. They will be inactivated. So clearly from these numbers, Election Day registration does provide access to voting on Election Day, but due to that process I discussed earlier where the computer verification doesn't happen till later, it does raise some integrity concerns for people. The other process I mentioned was called, what we call the Oath for Challenged Voters. This slide shows that in August of 2017, there were close to 31,000 people in the statewide voter registration system that had a challenge notation on their record. If a person showed up at a polling place on Election Day and there was a challenge by their name, the process would require that an election judge ask if they would solemnly swear to answer the following questions, and then the election judge would answer questions to address the challenge. So for example, have you been convicted of a felony and have you completed serving your sentence? And if the person indicates that they are eligible to vote, the election judge is directed to allow them to sign the roster and to vote. So like Election Day registration, this process can provide access to the ballot for people who are eligible to vote, but it may allow ineligible people to vote as well, inadvertently, but it can happen. We focused our review of this process on people who were challenged due to a felony conviction and voted in the 2016 election. There were 612 people who voted, although they were challenged due to a felony conviction, and we estimated about 400 of these people used this challenge process. For most of them, I'll be honest with you, we don't know if they were eligible to vote or not. Just having data is not enough to draw a firm conclusion about whether someone's eligible to vote. But by comparing their names with the results of some investigations that we had, we can tell you that some of the people, in fact, were eligible to vote. They had completed serving their sentence or had never been convicted of a felony, but others were ineligible and did vote in the 2016 election. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what can contribute to inaccurate information on the roster on Election Day. And there are several contributing factors. We kind of broke them down into county practices and then data quality issues. And so, for example, a county election staff person might incorrectly update a voter's record. We came across one voter who had been, her record had been marked as deceased because a county election person had incorrectly matched her with obituary information. There can also be data quality issues. And for example, due to timeliness, we looked at data that the State Court Administrator's Office reported to the Secretary of State's office about people who were discharged from their felony sentences. And during the period we reviewed, there was approximately 1 month delay in reporting those discharges to the statewide voter registration system. Now, given our research approach, we cannot tell you what percentage of records had incorrect information. We did just focus on people with a felony conviction, and we did just look at State Court Administrator's Office data. Our sense is that it's not a large percentage, but the fact that there are those errors and they can affect a person's voting experience, we think it's important to be aware of them. So, as I mentioned, we focused on people who had been challenged due to a felony conviction. And we noticed errors occurring in both directions. So for example, some voters should not have been challenged, but they were. In other cases, people were not challenged due to a felony conviction, but they should have been. In that later case, it was most often due to a timing issue. For example, the person was convicted on November 4th, but the voter rosters had already been printed for the county. In our review, we based all of this analysis on a report that the Secretary of State's office produces that identifies people whose status changes when they vote. And so it only looks at people who are printed on the voter roster as challenged. And we recommend that the Secretary of State office develop a report that would also identify people who have records in SVRS that are inactive, but suggest that they're challenged. And this would provide another way for county election officials to identify people who may have registered or voted while they are ineligible. And they could then refer those names on to law enforcement or the county attorney for further investigation to determine if there was actually a violation there. Now, as I just said, once county election officials identify people, they refer it to law enforcement or county attorneys. And we looked at nearly 2 years of reports made by county attorneys on the outcomes of those investigations. The reports were submitted, administrative rules require that county attorneys report the outcomes of the investigations to the Secretary of State's office. And we reviewed the reports from January 2016 through September 2017. So those are the report dates, not the violation dates. Reviewing those reports suggests that there were 69 cases of people registering or voting while they were ineligible to vote, and even more investigations where no violation was found. But there were some issues with these reports we were reviewing that in the interest of transparency, we know that the reports do not include all investigations. So for example, the report we reviewed from Hennepin County appeared to include only those investigations that were later referred to the county attorney for a charging decision. Well, there were other investigations that happened, but just hadn't been referred to the county attorney's office. It also appeared that these reports included investigations into voters' challenge status. So in other words, there was not a specific allegation that the person registered or voted when they shouldn't have. It was just kind of checking to make sure the challenge should or shouldn't be on the record. And then these investigation reports didn't include very detailed information. And that's one of the reasons we can't say more about how much ineligible registration and voting occurred. When we focused on our people who are challenged due to a felony conviction, we couldn't match their names up with the reports because the investigation reports didn't always include voter names. So we did turn to the state court administrator's office and we asked them for 7 years of information on filings and...
Ms. Meyerhoff, before you proceed, I do have a quick question for you. The stuff that you're detailing right now, would that also be that information be captured in the first recommendation that you have of the Secretary of State's office developing a report to identify inactive challenges? Would the things that you're discussing right now, where you say that because of some of the data you're unable to provide more detail, would that recommendation help with identifying those individuals in question?
Mr. Chair, on its own, it would not. Because the issue is those names would be referred to law enforcement or county attorney, but we would need the results of those investigations to be able to say more. So the report that we recommend would just identify more people to investigate.
Thank you. Proceed if you would.
Okay. So let's see, intentionally registering to vote while ineligible and knowingly voting while ineligible are felony offenses. And of those 69 cases that we identified as possibly being ineligible registration or voting, county attorneys do not always file charges. For example, they might not be able to show that it was intentional, registering was intentional, and that the person knew they shouldn't have registered. But we did look at these court data on charges that were filed and the outcomes. So over the 5-year period, fiscal years 2013 through 17, there were 162 charges filed for ineligible voting or registration. And so far, well, I guess it would have been the middle of last year, there were 47 convictions, 30 were still pending. And then for most of those convictions, fewer than half were at a felony level. So a lot of what I've been talking about so far is people registering or voting when they're not eligible. And I just kind of like to shift gears now and talk more about barriers to registration and registration access. So state law requires that State agencies provide voter registration services to their employees and members of the public. We surveyed the 23 state agencies that are on the governor's cabinet to determine the extent to which they provide these services. And we found that 14 of the 23 agencies provided voter registration services in 2016 to both employees and members of the public. The other 9 agencies, either directly or through the small agencies resources team, provided services to employees only. Now, some of those agencies that did not provide services to the public reported some uncertainty really about how to operationalize that requirement in state law. And for example, the Bureau of Mediation Services said, due to the sensitive nature of what we do, we're not quite sure how we would work this in. It would be a challenge.
Ms. Meyerhoff, do you happen to have the 9 agencies that you could share this morning with the committee?
Mr. Chair, it is in our report. I just need a second to find it.
Thank you.
Did you find it? Mr. Chair, it's on page 67.
And so if I'm reading the report correctly, or maybe Ms. Meyerhoff, since you're more familiar as the author or co-author of the report, I'll have you identify, just for those who may not have the report in front of them, who those 9 agencies might be.
The 9 agencies that provided services only to their employees were agriculture.
I'm the ones that don't have available to the public, I guess. But what we're talking about, everybody had something for their employees, but the 9 that didn't have for the public.
Right. Sorry if I misspoke, Mr.
Sorry.
Chair. Agriculture, commerce, education, health, Iron Range, resources and rehabilitation, management and budget, mediation services, and pollution control.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Proceed if you would.
Yes. We did ask other organizations or offices about services they provide. We spoke with the Secretary of State's office. So for example, they sponsored some public service announcements by local sports people, just encouraging people to register and vote. County and city election officials also reported various ways they try to promote voter registration. So for example, they might include a voter registration card with new resident packets. And then we also reached out to community action agencies to ask about their voter registration services. And if I can tell you just a little bit about what those agencies are, there are 24 community action agencies that cover the state, and they provide access to a range of public programs to help people become self-sufficient and more engaged in their community. And Minnesota rules require that these agencies have voter registration plans. So we asked the 24 agencies about their voter registration services. 18 of those responded that they typically provide these services by asking people who come in to apply for programs if they are registered to vote, and if they are not, if they would like to, and if they need help doing so. We also asked these agencies about barriers to voter registration, if they saw any barriers in their communities or among the people they serve. And 16 of the agencies did identify barriers to voter registration. The most common barrier identified just had to do with people not understanding the voter registration process, the types of information they need to provide, or where they need to go to register. The second most mentioned barriers had to do with either people feeling disconnected or disinterested, and like their participation in the process didn't really matter, or a lack of transportation. And that might have more to do with getting to the polls on election day, but for people who use election day registration, that could be a barrier. And then they mentioned several other issues in smaller numbers. So for example, people not having a proof of identity or residence, language barriers, or literacy barriers. And we also asked county and city election officials about barriers to voter registration, and most of them weren't aware of barriers, or they thought they were adequately addressed. But some of them also mentioned that language can be a barrier for people for whom English is not their first language. And I have mentioned a number of our recommendations kind of as I've gone through this presentation, and there's just one more I'd like to highlight, and that is that we recommend that the Secretary of State's office modernize the statewide voter registration system and work with the legislature to identify funding to do so. The statewide voter registration system was first developed in 2004, and since then has been modified a number of times to accommodate changes such as no excuse absentee ballots. It's just had to take on more tasks and a greater volume of transactions than it was originally designed to do. Most election officials we surveyed, the counties and the cities, were satisfied or very satisfied with the performance of the statewide voter registration system, although some said that it can be sluggish at times. But realizing that the system is quite dated now, it's had to accommodate some new requirements, and it will need to be modified again to accommodate the capability to record political party affiliation in the 2020 presidential primary. We recommend that the Secretary of State's office modernize the system. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude my comments.
Ms. Meyerhoff, thank you for your diligence on this and the work of your team in bringing this forward and being with us here today. I don't have any member questions at this point, but Representative Quam, others if you're interested.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Meyerhoff. Looking through the report, I didn't see, as part of HAVA in 303, there's a verification process, and that if you don't, for new registrants, and if you don't have a valid driver's license ID number, that then you would utilize the Social Security Administration has a link on a website, and the vast majority of states utilize the last four digits of the Social Security number along with the name, date of birth, and the other pertinent data to do a verification. During the year 2016, there were just under 160,000 verifications run through that site, and over 10% of those came back as being mismatched. I'm not seeing in here details of how many of those over 16,000 mismatches were actually eligible or found to be ineligible.
Ms. Meyerhoff, do you have any insight for us on that, or Ms. Randall?
Mr. Chair and Representative Quam, I do not. I'm not familiar with that section of HAVA, so I don't know if someone from the Secretary of State's office would be able to.
Representative Quam, follow.
Mr. Chair, it's not inconsequential that there were, and this is used by states, it's a national setup. It's made to comply with HAVA. In fact, they even call it Help America Vote Verification. And the Social Security Administration, has a fairly extensive database. And it's not just if things don't match, it also flags if there are people that are deceased and other things. And it's a backup to the integrity of the system. And I also, on that site, you can check weekly reports, and that election week of 2016, over 12.5% that were submitted were mismatched. And the week after, which I would think would probably include some of the same-day registrants, there are 16 states that have same-day registration. And so there's quite a bit of utilization probably after the fact. And the week after, 30% of those that were put in for verification failed. And so I assume that since the report was on voter registration, that the auditors would have checked, this federally required and actually, implementable and accessible that states across the nation are utilizing, and especially if we're, as a state, using it for, in that calendar year, about 160,000 new voter registrations. and that over 16,000 came up as being mismatched, I would have thought that would have been a very appropriate component of the audit. So the auditors aren't familiar and didn't verify, and this wasn't part of any of the audit activity? This verification of voter registration, is that what I'm, or is there somebody else within the auditors group that may be able to answer whether they actually did thoroughly and verify this?
Representative Quam, if I understand what your inquiry is, you're wanting to know if that system was within the scope of this particular assignment that the legislature gave to the...
Mr. Chair, no, because this was on voter registration, and in the discussion, in the report, they touched on verification of voters, both existing, whether they were challenged, they moved, so verification of the voter registration system, and this is a non-trivial component that is required. It's set up in Hava, and the federal government has this site which states are utilizing. So I'm trying to understand.
Before you interrupted
if that
me
was
when I was
included.
making my statement, I'm going to interrupt you, and let's just ask the auditors instead of you and I discussing something that neither one of us has firsthand knowledge of. Ms. Meyerhoff, I know that a similar or same question was asked, and I'll ask you to respond once again if you would like to. You've heard some of the interchange between Representative Quam and myself.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and I've been trying to look in our report to see if there's anything that even sort of touches on the question that Representative Quam has raised. And while we did talk about the verification process, we didn't break out the number of election day registrants and whether they were verified or not. What I might direct your attention to, although I don't think this directly answers Representative Quam's question, is in Appendix B of the report, which would be page 83. We had asked the Secretary of State's office for the status of all of the voter records in the statewide voter registration system in August 2017. And that
Ms.
indicates...
Meyerhoff, page 83, I don't know if we necessarily have in the report at page 83, we have some letters that are in the back. I think
It's
that...
about 5 pages from the back. I just have
It
to
would
find
be 83. There's no number on it. It's the Appendix B.
Very good. Thank
Sorry
you.
about that confusion. And so if someone doesn't pass verification through the processes that the statewide voter registration system uses, they would be challenged. And we have the challenged reasons listed here as of August 2017, which is after the 2016 election. And challenged for unverifiable would be in that other category. 4,856, but there are other challenge reasons in there. That's where they would be.
Thank you. Representative Quam, follow up?
Yes, Mr. Chair. When I looked at this over the past week since this was available, I noticed that if we did use that 48, just under 4,900, there's no way that over 16,000 mismatch would fit in a smaller number than 16,000. So that's where I thought that maybe this had not made it into this report. And that's why I'm trying to understand, you're summarizing, you're grouping things data-wise here and there. But, again, if it's over 16,000, that's a pretty good-sized chunk of, that I know a lot of people statewide don't mind having that kind of a margin or better, and we've had races that were closer. And that's why I bring it up is it stuck out as there's something missing in the story, and I wanted, to find out if it was missing because they weren't aware of and didn't have that information from the Secretary of State's when they did the audit, or if it was classified somewhere else. And apparently, I don't think the auditors happened to have picked up on this.
Representative Quam, I think it's your lucky day because one of the other presentations they're going to have is from the Secretary's office, and perhaps, knowing you, you may ask that question of the Secretary, and he is here, and I think that he's keenly aware of what the inquiry is. So let's try him when he's coming to the testifying table right now. He's going to wait. Certainly, Mr. Secretary, it's germane, it's timely. Then I have Representative Pugh and Representative Halverson with questions as well. Okay? Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Welcome to the committee. If you'll identify yourself for the record.
Thank
and if you need me to, I will ask Representative Quam to restate his question, or if you are familiar, you can begin to address it accordingly.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve Simon, Minnesota Secretary of State. I have some other remarks I wanted to get to about the report, but obviously I want to answer your questions first. Representative Quam, with me here is our Director of Elections, Gary Poser, and he can, I think, talk a little bit about the data points, but I do agree with what the folks from the Office of Legislative Auditor just said, which was, if you look more generally at all the challenges, they really did cover the waterfront. Whether the extent to which this particular database was used, I will defer to Mr. Poser and others, but I'm happy to talk about the overall numbers, which they do. If you look at both those that were flagged and challenged, those that were subject to investigation, those that ultimately ended up in prosecutions, I can tell you one thing that might bear on this, at least indirectly, that's not in the report, that's sort of fresher than that. The report, came out about a month ago, and the up-to-date numbers as of today, as far as I'm aware, of number of convictions for elections-related misconduct pertaining to the 2016 election is 11. So we're at 11 as of today, and as you heard, administrative rules require the county attorneys, the prosecutors all around the state, to report that information to us, and they do. That's public information. We're reworking, though, the rulemaking process right now, and we've gotten buy-in from members of this committee and other legislators as well. And the new administrative rules, if signed off on by the administrative law judge, will yield a richer set of data. For example, it will require names. You heard the Office of Legislative Auditor just now express some frustration that some of the reports don't include the actual name of the person. This new administrative rule that we've been on since far before this report was issued a month ago requires more specificity. So whether it's for the reason you discussed or others, we think we're well positioned to catalog this more. But we've got 11 so far. That's 11 too many. Obviously, we want it to be 0. Everyone at this table does. Everyone in Minnesota does. But that's 11 people out of almost 3 million voters. And while that's not perfection, it's close. And so we feel very good about where we are, but there are always ways that we can improve.
Mr. Poser, if you would like to comment, the Secretary did reference you, that you may be able to shed some light on this matter. If you'd like to identify yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Gary Poser. I'm the Director of Elections for the Secretary of State's office. And in response to Representative Quam, I'm unfamiliar with the numbers he's particularly stating or the percentages of mismatches that you're presenting. I will state that when records are entered by the counties into the system, a voter is either providing if they provided a driver's license number, that data would be compared with the driver and vehicle services information. If the individual provided only the last 4 of their social security number, that information is passed through driver and vehicle services to Social Security Administration, and those results of any verifications do come back and get passed through. I will note that the difference between driver and vehicle services, if somebody has provided a driver's license number, when those numbers are compared, they either come back as a complete match, so the name, the date of birth, and the driver's license number all completely match. Those are automatically flagged as verification. If somebody has either a typo or the name doesn't quite match, maybe there's a typo in the driver's license number, driver and vehicle services does provide back possible matches, so they either give the information that matches the driver's license number that was given, or they give information that matches the name and the date of birth, but the driver's license number doesn't match at all. And so they provide possible matches that the county auditors do review and can try and determine if that is the same person, and they would manually, so to speak, verify that information. That same type of possible match doesn't come back from the Social Security Administration. It is simply either a straight match, it's an exact match, or it comes back as a fail. and if it comes back as a fail, there's nothing else to, the county auditors could still look to see if they made a typo in the last 4 social, or if they had a typo in the name when they originally input the document, and they can try and resend that back if they found a change. But if it doesn't match at all, those are the records then that would show up with a challenge on the roster. And if it is one where it's a first-time federal voter in Minnesota, they do need to then provide information, the ID, to the election judges before they're allowed to vote.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to correct for the record that the Social Security Administration just doesn't give matched, unmatched. They also, and you can find it right on the website, number of deceased. So there's additional information instead of it's good or it's not. But, again, looking at, the table that's included on the unmarked page 83, the math just doesn't add up, because there are about 157,000 new registrations were submitted through to the Social Security Administration for verification. And of those, over 16,000 came back as, mismatched. The data didn't correlate. And, it'd be nice to understand what additional work was done, because I know we've gone to where we just sample. When we're sending in same-day registrations, we're just doing a sampling of those results. And it'd be nice to understand, because, again, this is not a trivial amount of votes that are out there. And, that's why it'd be nice to know exactly, oh yeah, we verified, all these 16,000 plus, and they fell into, these categories, as opposed to, when we have the stuff that's sent out, and we get a sample of the few hundred that are sent here and there, some data on that, which is in this report. And I think it also in report, or at least in the discussions I've had, that you are supposed to randomly send out that sample, and that no county is actually truly random. It's understandable what a lot of the counties are doing, because it's difficult to randomly do that. So I'm just trying to, if it had been 12 votes or something like that, but if you could get back, I know you probably don't have it in your back pocket, but if you could get back and give the committee the details on those mismatch, that from the federal agencies labeled as mismatch, that would be maybe give me a little bit more feeling of comfort.
Mr. Poser.
Mr. Chair and Representative Quam, just to comment on a few of the things, and I certainly don't have any numbers to provide you here today. The deceased coming from the Social Security Administration is actually processed differently. We do get that information through our participation in the ERIC, our Electronic Registration Information Center process. So we do get monthly deceased records from Social Security of anything that potentially matches our voter registration system, and that is passed on to the counties to process. So that's not quite the same as through the verification process that we're discussing. And the 3% sample is actually verifying, attempting to verify the residence portion. That's the postcard, I think, that Ms. Meyerhoff mentioned, is being mailed out to everybody who registers on Election Day. A postcard is mailed out to them to confirm their residence, which is different than verifying their identity with their name, birth date, and the number that was provided. So I'll just clarify that.
Mr. Poser, are you able to provide some additional insight outside of the scope of what we have available in the committee today to help Representative Quam with his question?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Quam, I think we would have to go back to our computer people to try and have them make that analysis. I know, I'm not sure exactly, don't recall exactly what we provided to the Office of Legislative Auditor, how much of that they'd be able to analyze. And I'd have to go back and see how much our computer people could go back and try and recreate back to November of 2016 to try and create that data. We can try and find out what we can.
Mr. Poster, I'm hearing a willingness because we can discuss this matter, but we don't have data in which to be able to work on. So I think that at this point is probably a workable solution to at least move it to another level. Representative Quam, is that okay? Before I ask the two of you to leave, there have been some other member questions, and so I'm just going to see if it's on the same topic before I have you. Representative Pugh, I think your question came in prior to this, and then I also have Mason and Lee. So Representative Pugh, if it's to the report itself or something on the topic that we have in front of us.
Actually, thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions did come in when Ms. Meyerhoff was presenting, and so I definitely am interested in following up there, but several things that came up since the gentlemen are here right now.
Yes, because I would like to get this resolved because
Okay.
they are coming back to talk about another matter that was in the recommendation, and I want to make sure that we have the time to be able to take care of that today as well.
Very good.
Representative Pugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question, a follow-up, is for Mr. Poser with regard to Eric that you mentioned. One of the issues that I spoke to the auditor about was Eric and the timely back and forth, of information between the states that are participating. My understanding is that there are less than half of the states participate, and I'm wondering if there is just some follow-up that you could share with the committee following as to which states, what the status of ERIC is, which states are participating and whatnot. And I asked that question because our son moved to Chicago, to Illinois, 3 election cycles ago, and I noticed that and voted. He told me he voted, registered and voted, and his name still appears on the Chanhassen P1A voter registration roll. And so my understanding was that with regard to this system, that there's supposed to be, communication and then updating of the voter registration rolls. So that was one thing I wanted to bring up. And also, and I don't know that we need to dwell on this, but your point of clarification, Mr. Poser, with regard to Siri, kind of scary.
Sorry.
Recognize my voice. It was with regard to the 3% postal verification audit. That was one of the not key findings in the summary page, but it seems as though there is clarification necessary from the Secretary of State's office to ensure that sampling is done in a more consistent way at the county level. And so if you want to speak to that, or not a big deal, but I think it's important.
Mr. Poser, some comments on the topic?
Mr. Chair and Representative Pugh, in regards to Eric, I think we are currently either at 22 or 23 members. I don't quite remember the exact number. Illinois did join probably in 2015, I believe, so they're one of the more recent additions. But our neighbors, states of Wisconsin, is our closest neighbor. That's also on there. But they're spread across the state, and more are going to be joining in the next few years, including, I think, Florida just approved joining in January of 2019. And yes, we do get, when we send information to Eric, if Eric does a match and we have 2 voters in 2 different states, Eric will say if there's more recent information in another state, they will notify us, and then the counties will process that and send out a postcard to the person saying, hey, it looks like you've moved out of state. If you don't respond to this notification within 21 days, your record will be in Minnesota will be inactivated. So I'm just not sure of, in your particular case, how close the match was. If Eric couldn't determine that it was the same individual, then that information wouldn't be passed on, or the postcards would have gone out, and then determining whether or not somebody responds to the postcard and how they respond. And how the county handled that. I couldn't speak to the individual case.
Representative Pugh, follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the only other concern that I have with regard to Eric, and thank you for that, is in follow-up to Representative Quam's concern about the deceased individuals and the Social Security administrative information. I'm very interested. I think every committee member would be interested in whatever the specifics were of what Representative Quam was mentioning. I think it's important to, get to the bottom of, what were those disconnects. But I am just wondering, about Eric. The deceased. If there are only 22 or 23 states participating, and then you referenced that's how we get those deceased individuals, well, then what about the other states? So.
Mr. Poser.
Mr. Chair and Representative Pugh, most states, I would believe, are doing the exact same thing that we have done, where we get our own Minnesota Department of Health records, which process 99% of the deceased. The Social Security match would then find that we get through Eric would find if somebody, maybe they died outside of the state, or that there wasn't enough information, maybe that just didn't quite match, that we weren't able to know that it was the same person.
Representative Pugh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Poser.
Representative Pugh, can I just ask you how many more questions you have? Just looking at the clock, and then we also have 2 other bills that we need to be looking at. I do want to give people a chance to be looking at it. I'm just wondering if some of the questions that you have may also be able to be handled offline with Mr. Poser, as we've been looking at some information. I don't want to hasten it, but I do want to make sure that we're using committee time efficiently today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. No further questions for Mr. Poser. However, the Secretary of State was acknowledging my question and concern about the 3%, the postal verification card process. I'm just wondering if this is something that you just wanted to make a quick reply to.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, any comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Pugh. Yeah, we support every single one of the recommendations in the report, and in fact, we've been moving on them since well before this report, some of them since well before the report was released. So yes, we support them all, including those that will require legislative action. The 3% may require some legislative action, so we're happy to work with you and your colleagues on that, but we support every recommendation in this report.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Pugh. Representative Mason and Representative Lee. Representative Mason, to the topic, or is it back to Ms. Meyerhoff?
No, actually, I think they could answer the question that I have.
Representative Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at the charges or the graphs showing people that are ineligible, particularly those that are ineligible due to the felon. And I guess I'm thinking the argument could be, are the people that have been charged with felons, is that an additional way of punishing them, or did it have to do with the process? And when I'm looking at the number of charges, I mean, there's not a lot of numbers here. That it would seem to me it would be easier if we just didn't do anything. Felons should not be ineligible to vote. I mean, we're not talking a whole lot of numbers here.
Mr. Secretary.
Am I clear?
Mr. Chair and Representative Mason, so on the felon issue, again, what I would say is this, and others in my office here can clarify, of the 11 convictions, I think a large majority of those were people who were still serving a felony sentence. So that accounts for a big percentage of the problem. And one of the issues that a lot of folks have talked about around the Capitol is whether we should move towards the North Dakota model. There's growing bipartisan support for that, which says that, and there's a growing number of states moving in that direction, which says that if you're in prison, you can't vote, but when you're out of prison, you can. And that's what North Dakota and other states have adopted, and of course that would get rid of this problem. Obviously that's a value judgment that you and your colleagues will have to make, but yes, that bears on this for sure.
Representative Mason, if
Thank
you
you.
are going to do a follow-up, I do want to keep it to the contents of the report, and that was not something that was within the scope of the report. That is something for this committee, who does have jurisdiction, to debate as to what the public policy merits of that are. Representative Lee.
Mr. Chair, to the report.
To the report?
Yep.
Okay, so,
I'm going to ask the Office of the Legislative Auditor, please.
very good. Thank you, gentlemen, and we'll bring back Ms. Randall and Ms. Meyerhoff. And Representative Lee, if you would like to, then when they get back, proceed with your question. Representative Halverson.
Mr. Chair, as the Office of the Legislative Auditor is coming back down. Are we going to get to hear the Secretary of State's response to this? I think we kind of got a little off order, and I just
I'm
want to be
sorry,
sure we
the
get to
response to what,
hear
Representative Halverson?
the report itself.
If you take a look, we do have the Secretary of State as a separate line item. If we do get a chance to get to that today based on member questions and things, and I do want to allow latitude because this is an important thing with our election integrity. So, Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so my questions are more around our list of approved documents for same-day registration. And the first question is, do the Office of the Legislative Auditor have any recommendations to address the concerns of our community action agencies about the barriers to registration, knowing that on page 45 and 75, most election officials were unaware of barriers to registration and thought that more options for proof of residence on election day were not unnecessary.
Ms. Meyerhoff?
Mr. Chair and Representative Lee, we did not make any recommendations about how to address the concerns that the community action agencies addressed, or whether to expand or restrict proofs of residence on election day. We kind of heard from people in both directions. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Representative Lee?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Meyerhoff?
We didn't make any recommendations about that. We just pointed out what some of the concerns were, and that I think most of the election officials that we surveyed did not think changes were necessary for proofs of residence on election day.
Representative Lee?
Mr. Chair, and did they provide any explanation as to why they did not think that it was necessary then?
Ms. Meyerhoff?
Mr. Chair and Representative Lee, they didn't, but they also, most of the people we heard from, it was in a survey. So I don't know if they would have talked more about it. And I guess I would say the occasional election official thought, for example, we should allow property tax statements. But then there'd be another election official who would say, you know, completely unrelated, well, we might need other options, but we definitely shouldn't allow property tax statements. And so without doing more of work to determine like what would be the pros and cons of all the different options, we just didn't feel like we could go in either direction.
Representative Lee?
Mr. Chair, last question, and this is for the OLA and for the Secretary's office. Do you, as the Office of the Legislative Auditor, have any opinion on if our current list of approved documents are adequate for same-day registration?
Ms. Meyerhoff?
Mr. Chair and Representative Lee, I guess I would say that when we reviewed incident logs out at 92 sample precincts, we looked at the incidence of people unable to register on election day, and it was pretty small. And so, you know, I think if we had looked at those incident logs and we had seen, oh, there's hundreds or thousands of people who aren't able to register on election day, we would have had some concerns about whether the options that are currently allowed were sufficient. But given that it was a pretty small number, no.
Representative Lee, I'm going to ask a representative from the Secretary's office, since you did ask if they have a comment on it, and I am seeing Ms. Struther is going to take a swing at it, it looks like. Good morning and welcome to the committee. If you'll state your name for the record and who you represent.
Julie Strawther, Minnesota Secretary of State's office. To your question, the only thing I would note on page 14, where it identifies the proofs that other states are using, we did identify that there were some proofs like the government document or a paycheck that we're not currently using, and we thought that was an interesting data point in this report. So.
Representative Lee. Ms. Meyerhoff, we'll have you and Ms. Randall come back, and the only other person that I know that had some questions to follow up was Representative Pugh wanted to ask you a few additional questions, and I have no other member questions at this time. So Representative Pugh, if you'll proceed with your final questions.
Thank you, Ms. Meyer. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Meyerhoff. And I just want to thank you for all of your work. I want to thank you for your time meeting with me prior to the report having been published, you and your team. And I've had some time to be, considering all of this material. And in fact, I was reminded when I pulled it back out again yesterday to prepare for today's hearing, how I didn't allow myself enough time for the complexities of this issue. You know, there's so many data points and things to consider. So just really appreciate that. At the beginning of your presentation today, you articulated, I think, well, the really important balance between integrity, election integrity and accessibility. And the report is, filled with findings and a lot of key points. And, as I mentioned to you in the office, and you even referenced today the concern that some have, and I would be, one of those some, that when there are concerns with regard to election integrity, even one voter being disenfranchised by having another who was ineligible, who in fact voted, is of concern to me. And the report, just looking at the first page, and I think I made the chair a little nervous because I'm a note taker and I have like notes all over the place, but I'll be very
Two
brief.
different colored tabs, that's what kind of got me going.
I've actually 3 different color tabs going and 2 different colors of pen. But the first page you mentioned, they referenced 9 key findings, and it's concerning to me that 6 of those don't really come with specific recommendations. And, for example, there are a lot of, but the very first or the second one is depending upon how and when persons register to vote, their identity and eligibility to vote might not be checked against others. And then but they may allow ineligible persons to vote as a result of the difference between how a voter is checked on on election day versus prior to the cutoff. And then the following finding with regard to the county, but a voter's information may be inaccurate on the roster, and we've seen and heard a lot about that, and but allowing ineligible people to vote, and it just kind of goes on, and I'm just really concerned about that. Look forward to continuing to work well beyond when we're done with this legislative session on improving election integrity. And I just wanted to make one other point. The report summary on the very first paragraph on the second page, S2, you noted that election integrity is important to our democracy, and I would just say it's just absolutely critical. And you referenced, stated, eligible citizens should have confidence that their vote will count. Well, their vote certainly, does count. I mean, they know when they put it in the machine that it is in fact counted. But I think it's equally important, and I didn't really sense that from the report. So it's just a disappointment that every time somebody who is ineligible to vote does, that disenfranchises another eligible voter. And I think that that's why there is this discomfort with the degree to which we have election integrity in Minnesota, and I'm just concerned about that. So I guess I don't really have a specific question, unless you wanted to make a comment.
Any brief comments that you want to use to respond, since Representative Pugh is fairly articulate in her concerns?
No, Mr. Chair and Representative Pugh, I would just thank you for your earlier comments about our work, and I thank you for these comments too. And if you'd like to talk about anything in particular at another time, I'd be happy to meet with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And members, this is a starting point. This is not an ending point. This report came about because of suggestions and work by members of the legislature. And we do thank you for your work. We realize that you are reporting data. You're not the creator of the data, but you are the investigators, if you will, on behalf of that and the auditors. And we do thank you for your time with us today. Appreciate it, as we always do.
I have one other little follow-up.
With that, Representative Pugh.
Just have one other small follow-up question with regard to the community action agencies. I referenced that page in the booklet, page 73, and I'm wondering if in this report those 24 agencies are listed. I did not see that, and I saw that 18 of the 24 completed a response, but I'm curious as to who those agencies and entities are.
Ms. Meyerhoff.
Mr. Chair and Representative Pugh, I do not believe we have it listed in the report, but I can get that information for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you. With that, we have the two recommendations that the Secretary of State's office they've already identified in here, and I know that Secretary Simon has some information to share with us, and I don't anticipate this to go extremely long. So, Mr. Secretary, we'll have you come down and have you share with us your information and thoughts on the recommendations and where the organization is at, and then we will get to the two final informational hearings with Representative Garofalo. So with that, Mr. Secretary.
Just to make sure that the Secretary of State's comments are brief, I'm going to come up here with them.
Mr. Secretary, all due respect, has there been a coup? Mr. Secretary, did you want me to get the sergeant's office?
With this guy, you never know, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Quick.
If you'll state your name for the
Thank you
record
very much.
and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Steve Simon, Secretary of State. It's great to be accompanied by my friend, Representative Garofalo, although he's here for other reasons, I guess, that will follow me. I want to thank you and all members for their work on this issue. So I just wanted to say quickly, and I will be quick, the number one takeaway for me from the OLA report, the number one takeaway is the need to modernize and to rebuild the statewide voter registration system, or SVRS database. It is crucial, it is critical. Mr. Chair, I know you're on board with that priority, and many other members are. This is the backbone of our system. It's not just a database of registered voters. As the OLA alluded to, it does so much more than that, and it's been asked to do so much more since it was built, and built well, in 2004. It was built with over $6 million of federal and state funds, mostly federal funds from the Help America Vote Act, and it was built very well for 2004, just like your 2004 flip phone was built well for 2004. That's Mr. Gelman's cue, I guess, too. The point is, it really does need substantial updating. And although you heard in the report that the vast majority of counties are happy or very happy with its performance, we know that we need to do more because it's been asked to do so much more since 2004. I don't need to tell you, but I will repeat for the record that Minnesota was one of the 21 states that was targeted by a foreign government in the last election. We were not hacked. We weren't even the subject of really an attempted hack, but we were cased. We were probed. And 2 of those 21 states were not so fortunate. Illinois and Arizona did suffer a breach. And the breach that they suffered was to their equivalent of what we call SVRS. We're very conscious of that. I've been dealing with, and our office has been dealing with, federal intelligence authorities for the last several months. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security did designate election systems in this country to be critical infrastructure, which is a term in federal law that entitles us to certain information, including intelligence briefings and the expertise of the Department of Homeland Security, who was in our office physically last week doing all sorts of testing and probing and nudging. And so what does that mean? Well, fortunately, we have a partner in the federal government, and as you and many members know, about 3 weeks ago, quite unexpectedly, we got some really good news. It's good news that took by surprise even members of Congress from Minnesota and elsewhere, which is that the federal government in its giant omnibus spending bill slipped in a provision for $380 million for cybersecurity or election security in the states. And I'll fast forward, Mr. Chair, just for the benefit of members, our share of that is $6.6 million, I'm rounding, but about $6.6 million in Minnesota, but it requires a 5% match. We have 5 years to spend the money, but we have 2 years to come up with the match. And if we don't come up with the match in 2 years, that money will be clawed back, even if we've already spent it. So we want to be very thoughtful in our approach in terms of how we spend that money, not to spend it all in one place. And I think what I can say, Mr. Chair, because you and I have discussed this, and I've discussed it with other members of this committee and other legislators, that the plan is this. We have met already with our partners at the local level, which is crucial and critical. We don't want to make moves like this without consulting them, meeting with them, getting their complete buy-in and agreement if possible. So we've already met with the Association of Minnesota Counties, with the Minnesota Association of County Officers, MACO, with the League of Minnesota Cities, with the Minnesota Association of Townships, and I think I'm safe in saying, and any of them can contradict me if I've got it wrong, but here is our proposed or suggested game plan. that we use roughly $1.5 million of that money, which is going to come to us, by the way, no later than May 17th from the federal government. We use $1.5 million of that money for upgrading the statewide voter registration system. It's a 4-year project, and there's no mystery to it. It's hiring 3 people for 4 years to do the computer coding. That's it. This is not like a certain other enterprise computing system that's been much in the news lately. This couldn't be farther from that. This is not a brand new system. This is just recoding the existing system. No interruption in service. There's no flick of a switch that's supposed to transfer to some new system. That we use that money, which includes about $87,000 worth of modifications that and changes that Homeland Security is recommending that we implement and do this year before the November election. So it's about $1.5 million, a little bit more. I think it's $1,534,000 and change. But that requires that requires an act of the legislature. In most states, it's a one-step process. The federal government releases the money to our state HAVA account, Help America Vote Act account, and that's it. That's the end of it. In Minnesota and a few other states, it's trickier than that. It's a 2-step process. You, the legislature, have to do more than that. You have to actually appropriate the money to our office so that we can use it. So we're not asking for you to appropriate all of the money. I think most of the other states, they have all the money and they'll get all the money. We're not even asking for that. We're asking for you to appropriate about $1,534,000 this year, and then we vow to work not only with the partners I just mentioned, but with the legislature to recreate the same working group that we did for the elections equipment, which turned out so successfully last year, and thank you again for that, which would be staff and legislators from all 4 caucuses, plus the groups that I just mentioned, plus others that may be recommended, and that we come back to you, the legislature, in January of next year with a plan to spend the rest of the money. And exercising your oversight function, you might look at the plan and say you love it all, or you love most of it, or you only love a little bit of it, but at least you'll have a base on which to build. So we spend the interim coming back to you with a plan for the other money and get as much of that match this year appropriated as possible. So it's getting the match, as much of it as possible, and getting an appropriation of the $1.5 million. And just to be clear, this comes out of no one's budget target. This is federal money, direct pipeline to the HAVA account, doesn't count against anyone's target. This isn't general fund money. It's not money that isn't being spending on some better, worthier priority. This is just money from the federal government that you're authorizing us to spend. It's the same way it was done when HAVA was initially passed in 2002, 2003. I don't think I've left anything out, Mr. Chair, but thank you for your time and attention. I know you have
Mr. Secretary, you also had, there was also a second recommendation, and you've done a pretty good job of talking about the security portion of the statewide voter registration system. There was also a recommendation that the Secretary's office should consider developing a report to identify inactive challenged voters who register on elections day. Are you prepared to share any comments with the committee today on that recommendation, Mr.
Yes,
Secretary?
we agree with it. We're doing it, and it will be done in time for use by November this year.
Thank
this
you.
election. Yes.
Members, questions of, well, Mr. Secretary, did you bring a testifier with you today?
That's not how I would put it, Mr. Chair, but there is one here, whether I
Duly
brought him or
noted.
not. Right.
Duly noted, Mr. Secretary. Members, questions. Representative Halverson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I was anxious to hear what your response was and what advice there was for the legislature, because ultimately the reason that we ask for these reports is to find out what action we need to take as a body in order to make sure that our statewide voting system is as intact as possible. And one of the things that I am taking away from this report that I think I would like to hear you comment on is that there are no recommendations listed here to change the way that we verify voter registration in Minnesota. We've had over 350,000 people register same day in Minnesota, and those went through rigorous verification processes that I think that we don't get to see a lot. I hear a lot of questions making some assumptions about challenged voters, that if you're challenged, you're automatically ineligible. And so perhaps, and I will say to the chair, maybe we need to look at a further date, since this is all of interest to us, down the road, to really workshop how we do voter verification, both at the state level and at the county level. We haven't gotten to hear from the counties on this yet, and I think that's worthwhile. But I do think that it is really important to note that the state legislature asked to set out to find out if our voter registration systems are strong and intact, and the fact that we're not seeing any major changes recommended to the way we verify voters, other than to modernize and strengthen our systems, which I think makes a ton of sense, particularly not so much with the threat of the folks internally in our state that have interest in elections, but those folks externally from the United States who want to change the outcomes of our elections really are showing to be a pretty significant risk. And I just wonder if you have any comments on behalf of yourself or of the previous secretaries who helped to build this system that we're using today.
Secretary Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will say that credit belongs not only to those who preceded me in this office of both parties, but it really belongs with local governments. 87 counties, countless cities and townships who do the hard, unglamorous work of elections administration at the front line. We don't count a single ballot in our office. We don't own a single piece of elections equipment. We don't directly train a single election judge. All of that work in making sure that the elections run smoothly is done at the local level. I wish I could take credit for that. I can't. They deserve it. It takes 32,000 election judges, 32,000 to run an election in this state. That's a small army. So if you meet one, past, present, or future, thank them. They're not doing it for their health. They're not doing it to get rich. They're doing it as a public service, and I think most people think that the system in that respect is well run, but credit belongs to those at the front lines at the local level who are doing the counting and who are doing the screening, and who have given us, I think, a good system that, of course, is always in need of continuous improvement and self-improvement and all the rest. That's what this report talks about. That's why we support every single recommendation, but it's a solid system. Others deserve a lot of credit for that.
Other member questions for Secretary Simon or his adjunct testifier? Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. I see no other questions, and